Gender activists have decried the spat in Parliament by the ANC's boy Mamabolo and Julius Malema about the abuse of women, calling it inappropriate and saying it used women's experiences to score political points. Here to discuss that with us is doctoral fellow at the Wits City Institute and well-known gender activist Lisa Vetten. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us.
Lisa.
Your first thoughts, by the way, when you saw all of that unfold?
Really, really concerning because, again, it's taking the focus off the issue, the things that we should be debating, especially picking up the points that the President made last week around SONA. Are those really the best and the most important options for us to deal with gender-based violence? And to see this just becoming a way to score points. What it did suggest to me in a very weird way is that it suggests a strange kind of progress at the same time. I mean, if we think that back in 2009 we elected a president who had been through a rape trial, who had said some extremely problematic things about women and sex. So the fact that now it's becoming something that people are using to question each other, even if it's done in a very questionable ways, does suggest that there's a level at which people do think there might be something wrong with behaving badly towards women.
And I want to look at it from multiple angles, that behaving badly against women, because some of these things are systemic as well.
Yes.
So I want to look at Parliament. Obviously, where it happened is very important, because if we also look at the etymology of terms such as empowerment, some say it means different things to different people. So were women disempowered by that conversation?
I think they were in a range of different ways. First, it was men speaking on behalf of women who hadn't asked those women if they wanted them to stand up and suddenly become reborn feminists on their behalf. So it was not empowering in that sense. And I think what was also concerning was it turned it into an individualized matter. Julius Malema, Cyril Ramaphosa. Instead of going to the systemic issues, the broader problem, and what is it as Parliament that we are doing as the problem. I think it also glosses over the fact that Parliament itself, some of its procedures around dealing with sexual harassment, this is not just at national level but at provincial legislature level as well, leave a lot to be desired. In some instances they're absent. So those are the kinds of systemic structural issues they need to be looking at instead of distracting us by focusing on individuals seeking to cause scandal.
So let's continue to look further at the concept of empowerment and obviously how it relates to women. And so just looking at various statistics that have been published on gender-based violence, how often it occurs. Some people have lamented the fact that it actually moves away from putting blame squarely on who the perpetrator is. It actually speaks about it in a very abstract way, that it also enforces, greater violence on women.
Certainly, I think if we talk about men's violence towards women, it does really locate very definitely who is the source of it and where it originates. But I think a term like gender-based violence, where it is useful, is because it brings us here to the notion of gender and relations and how our society is organized along lines of hierarchy which gender determines. So I think if we can use it as an analytical way to look at how are those relations working, because they don't stay the same. I mean, the fact that I said 10 years ago we could elect a president with a track record in relation to very problematic statements, and now it's a problem, suggests that something about those relations have shifted, not necessarily for the better, they've just taken a new form, and we need to be able to understand that.
So let's talk about a new form that it's taken. So the President is saying, the problem with this is that it does take away attention from the actual problems. And if we talk about the empowerment of women, as I said, staying with that concept and management systems, because I think this also exposed just the hierarchy of decisions, where they're taken, how they're taken, and who they implement. So that choice to use the word as in any way, whether it can be misconstrued or whatever concept you could apply to it.
I mean, I think if we go back to talking about things like empowerment and focusing on women, what we should have been debating was when the President gave his speech last week, he focused on the largely criminal justice system responses to addressing gender-based violence. And we should have been asking, is that the best and the only way? Why is there a disconnect in your speech between this and all your youth economic empowerment initiatives? Why are we not seeing this problem as also being a problem of political economy? Why do we persistently see it only in relation to men's attitudes towards women and not see how these get structurally embedded through questions like economy and the political decisions that we are making around who to prioritize, how to prioritize, and what to do? So those are the sorts of conversations we need to be thinking about, not like did you hit, not personal
This is what I'm
accusation.
saying, because it almost seems like when we talk about gender-based violence, we just reduce it to men hitting, physically hitting women. So the operational definitions of what we're dealing with and how we're going to inculcate it into a system if we're going to fix it is what I'm saying. Are we broadening the understanding, the debate, the discussion around gender-based violence and how to stem it?
No, we're not, because I think, again, if we go back and we look at economy, I think one of the things that one can see through research is that very difficult economic circumstances tend to strain men and women's their relation with each other and their relationships anyway. And they're often factors that trigger and aggravate violence. They don't cause it, but they can become a trigger for it. So we need to look at what is the current state of our economy right now. What might that tell us about increases in violence? We also need to look at, if you look at our murder statistics, they have been going up since 2012-13, every single year, after having declined for almost 15 years. So we need to get an understanding of what are these broader things going on in our society that we are not paying attention to because we keep on individualizing the problem.
Because part of it is that gender-based violence is based on normative understandings of gender, the roles that are culturally played by men, women, children, and the fact that people have now moved away from non-binary terms of defining who they are.
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, I think we talk about, I'll give you an example of where we should be highlighting and foregrounding gender. We're talking a lot about unemployed youth. That's a very gender-neutral word. When you go and look at the statistics and the breakdown of who are those unemployed youth, you will see that they are predominantly young women. And part of the reason why they are there is because they've had pregnancies, they've had to drop out of school, they haven't been able to continue their education, they may be at home looking after others. So all the kinds of care relationships that are specifically attached to or expected of women come together. They're disadvantaged in relation to education. The fact that we haven't found ways to put them back into education, the fact that we do not provide them with childcare so that they can go out and work, place them in positions where they become economically dependent. And so it entraps them within relationships where men could be abusive and they may feel they have very few options because we haven't thought about the economic links, because we haven't thought about how housing and human settlements have a role to play in addressing domestic violence, for example. So it's precisely the thing of how do we broaden it to look at the structures and the systems that maintain things, because women can feel personally empowered, but if the structures and systems act as barriers, it doesn't matter how personally empowered they feel in some ways.
So, and I want to also look at what we've started to accept as normal in a society like this, especially in urban areas like, and we're talking within that economic context that you're speaking about. When people do and accept such things, I'm going to talk about young women who, as you say, aren't educated, come from poor households, and the things that some would question whether or not they're forced to do to survive. There are people who actually question that without actually looking at the realities they have to contend with.
I think, a lot of our approaches to South Africa, to South Africans' lives, each other's lives, tend to be very moralistic. You should be doing this, you should be doing that, you're a bad person. Whereas we should just look at them and see them as much more circumstantial. These are your options, these are the options available to you. How is it that you get coerced into making the kinds of decisions you do? And how do we offer you better kinds of choices and how do we also not judge the choices you make? Because sometimes, as you're saying, they are contextual and they are circumstantial, and if we were in those same positions, we would quite possibly do the same things.
So how do we change the attitudes of behaviors of men and women in Parliament after this debacle? It has helped to create room for discussion about these issues, but how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again, that women aren't further brutalized by a system?
What I think is going to be very important is that all those party whips need to call their members together and ensure that they are properly educated around both gender equality and gender-based violence. Because we're going to have legislation coming towards Parliament later this year that deals with gender-based violence. If the performance we saw in Parliament is the extent and the quality of their level of understanding, then we are in deep trouble. Because it's likely they'll use it as an opportunity to just score points again.
Thank you so much for that and your insight. Doctoral Fellow to Wits City Institute, Lisa Vetten.